Hi, I'm Catherine Pack, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Australia Chair here at CSIS, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Pacific Policy Pulse. I'm joined here today by the Honourable Scott Morrison. He was the 30th Prime Minister of Australia. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Catherine.
So what brings you to DC this week?
Well, amongst a number of other things, I'm the Vice Chair of American Global Strategies, headed up by the former NSA Robert O'Brien, and he and I were closer together when I was Prime Minister under the first Trump administration, and after leaving politics, we teamed up. So we've had a great national security conference here in DC this week, bringing together some of the key decision makers out of the administration and our own clients, and it's always good to remain involved in that discussion.
So Australia has an upcoming national election on 3 May. How much do you think foreign policy and national security are going to play into this election this year?
Not largely. That's not unusual in Australian elections. Like in most developed democracies, they're always about local issues. Politics is always local. The economy will feature, I think, heavily. Cost of living, those types of things. Not unlike the set of issues you saw here in the United States, really. Immigration issues, I think, will feature. To the extent that international relations issues are playing into the election, on most of the big issues, there's a lot of bipartisanship. Certainly, I think, on the issues of the alliance, on issues of the threat of China in the region, there are differences, I think, in around tone, and quite serious ones. Probably the most important issue, though, internationally, which will play into the election, would be the issue of Israel and Gaza. There's been a real sharp contrast in the approach to that issue by the coalition and the government, and the Jewish community in particular has been highly critical of the government's response. And I know that is playing out on the ground pretty heavily. But that said, the Jewish community is an important one in Australia, but I wouldn't describe it as a large one right across the country. But it does play out in particular parts of the country.
So what about AUKUS? How do you think that might play into this election cycle?
Well, thankfully, AUKUS enjoys strong bipartisan support in Australia. It brings us all together. Ambassador Rudd and I, once political opponents, now very much singing from the same song sheet on what's necessary on AUKUS, and I think there's been really good progress. And it's great to see that is true here in the United States with the new administration, as it was under the Biden administration, and of course in the UK as well. So AUKUS has really cleared those hurdles. Sure, there's heaps more to be done on the regulation reform. There's heaps more to be done, I think, on budgets on Pillar 2 and continued direction and tangibility on some of those projects. I suppose the more significant issue domestically, politically in Australia is what the overall level of funding support is for defence. Now, a number of us, myself included, have been calling for moving to 3% of GDP. That's a leap from where we are now. But it was a leap when we got to 2.1% when I was Prime Minister. So, and we did that over 9 years to get there almost. So the same commitment is required. AUKUS will take a serious chunk of that, but you need to keep all the other programs going. And, the perception is that there's a bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul on this, and Paul needs the money, but so does Peter in defence. And I think that's also what's coming out of the bilateral discussions between the US and Australia, and the US and many of its allies and partners. So I don't think Australia in any way has been lagging necessarily, but that's now. And what's going to happen over the next sort of 10 years and 5 years, I think, is really important. So we'll have to lift our rate of effort. There's no doubt about that. And as will many others within the Five Eyes, within the many other partnerships. And so I think that's a pretty real issue for us all to grapple with.
Absolutely. And of course, I'd be remiss with all the churn in the news right now about tariffs if I didn't ask how that might be playing in Australia for these elections.
Well, we're a free trading nation and we like tariffs to be low. I mean, that's how Australia's economy has always worked. We're different to the United States. The United States has a critical mass of its own economy where it can make the sort of decisions that it's making as part of its industrial policy. That's up to the government. We're all sovereign jurisdictions. We can make our own decisions about what our own policy should be. So, Australians don't want to see tariffs go up, obviously. But you've got to understand that as part of the broader relationship as well and what the US is trying to achieve. I have a lot of sympathy with the view which says industrial policy in the US needs to focus on rebuilding the industrial base. And that has obvious flow on into the defence industrial base. And that's as important for allies and partners that the US can produce as much as anyone. So the objectives, I think, can be clearly shared. The question is, how do we all work together to make sure that's achieved? In the region, because Australia has no tariffs, but for the region, I think it's important that there's a lot of messaging which counters the narrative which says that the US in some way is walking away from important defence and security dialogues, partnerships, alliances, etc. China will clearly want to run that narrative which says the US is becoming isolationist, just like they're trying to argue that regarding Ukraine. It's nonsense. If anything, I'd argue there's a stronger focus on the Indo-Pacific coming out of this reset. And that's a positive thing for security in the region. But that initiative runs the risk of becoming confused in an economic discussion around tariffs. And so that's a challenge for the administration. That's a challenge, though, not just for the administration, but members of Congress and others who have many connections and linkages into the region, I think, to be providing reassurance around the security commitments. Now, of course, they will want to see defence commitments from partners and allies increase, including Australia. But that's not a statement of any lack of resolve, I would hope, and nor do I think it is, from the United States to the region. And because it's very much in the US's national interest to ensure that the Indo-Pacific is secure, and they have an irreplaceable role in that. And countries in the region often sometimes need to be reassured about that. Even if it's not questioned at the US end, these types of developments can cause questions, which, if directly settled, is helpful.
So with all the travel that you're doing, I'm sure you're doing a lot of reading. What book do you have on your shelf these days?
Well, rather than reading briefs, which is what used to consume all my time when I was in politics, I've really have upped the tempo on things I've been dying to read. I had a stack of books when I left office, which I'm pulling through. I just finished Mike Waltz's Hard Truths, actually, which I found really interesting. It's not a long read. It's quite enjoyable. Mike tells some amazing stories about his time in Afghanistan in particular. And so for those looking to better know and understand Mike Waltz, I think it's an important read. The last chapter is particularly important in terms of his insights in the Indo-Pacific and foreign policy issues that focus his mind. He's not backwards in coming forwards on those, but that's Mike. But so now the next one is Amitav Ghosh's book on the Opium Wars, and looking forward. I've always enjoyed his reading, his work, particularly his novels and so on. But it's when you look at the Indo-Pacific, understanding a lot of the sort of heritage drivers and history drivers of that, I think you can't avoid that. It plays into the thinking of the region, I think, pretty heavily, and no more so than that period of time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Pacific Policy Pulse.
Thanks a lot.